You spent a lot of time in what's called a Skunk Works. We have a little defining of times that you spent and what things are. So let's start a little bit with what is a skunk work?
Well, that was something that was accidentally created. In 1943, Kelly Johnson, who was a vice president in Lockheed, created a group of people to build the first jet aircraft that actually went into production and later on into actual military service. And he was given a contract to build one aircraft, and he promised to build it within 180 days, which was quite sensational. He had a little bit of difficulty getting the proper engine for it, but he was able to assemble a group of approximately 25 people, including himself. That was engineers, shop people, I don't know who else, people to procure things. Okay. And he actually accomplished what he had promised to do in 180 days, in 143 days. And the group who actually designed and built the airplane built it in a very, I'll call it ramshackle situation. It was a building that they actually built next to another building in the Lockheed group. They built their building out of lumber, which was salvaged from aircraft engine boxes, and covered the top with a rented, I'll call it a circus tent. And they worked under these conditions and done that job very well. One of the engineers one time answered the telephone and said Skunk Works. That was the name of a facility in a comic strip in the newspapers in those days called Lil Abner, L-I-L Abner. And Kelly Johnson heard him answer the phone. He didn't like the name or the name of the comic strip characters, who had a facility somewhere out in the woods, presumably in the southeast part of the country, in which he rendered, which means boiled, skunks, old shoes, and, quote, other ingredients to make what they call kickapoo joy juice. That was the origin of the name Skunk Works. The engineer who was, let's say, the person who made the Skunk Works reply on the telephone was Irving Culver, one of the best engineers that Kelly could find in Lockheed. And Kelly didn't like that name, so he fired Irv Culver, but he rehired him in about 10 minutes later. And eventually, Kelly got to the point where he liked that title, Skunk Works, instead of Skunk. There would have been a problem with the newspaper publisher about using the term Skunk Works. Eventually, it became a logo that was prominent on quite a large number of aircraft that Lockheed produced. So today, there's a cartoon-like image of a cute little skunk, and the words Skunk Works became, well, I'm sure it has been properly protected for copyright laws and so on. So it's, even today, it's a legitimate logo for the Lockheed Martin Company.
Well, you spent a lot of time with Lockheed during the 1950s Cold War, where every day it seemed the Cold War was getting hotter and hotter.
You're right, absolutely correct.
Well, for our listeners, would you give us a kind of a feel for what it was like back then?
Well, for those who did not experience it, it might seem strange, but the Cold War was really a very dangerous time. Joseph Stalin, who was the dictator of the Soviet Union, had an ambition to take over all of Europe and possibly all of the United States. Well, fortunately, of course, he didn't, but during the early part of that era, which was actually the Cold War started in 1943 near the end of World War II, but it got really hot after World War II was officially finished. And during those times, we, the United States, had no really good way of finding out what the Soviets were trying to do, what they wanted to do, and where they wanted to do it, and when they wanted to do it. So we had to have some kind of a way to do this. The CIA was formed for that reason, and they were unable to employ informants on the ground to provide credible information. And Dr. Richard Bissell, heir of the Bissell fortune, was appointed director of a project to obtain information concerning weapons development and deployment by the flying an aircraft over the Soviet Union. Bissell and a group of consultants determined that there was no aircraft available or that could be modified in time to fly safely over the Soviet territory and get the required information. A new aircraft was needed very urgently. In 1954, Lockheed's Kelly Johnson, was given a contract to design and build that new aircraft, which became the U-2 subsonic reconnaissance vehicle. It was called a U-2 because it was that's a designation of what's called a utility vehicle, and that was, of course, trying to not reveal what the real purpose of it was, but of course the Soviets found that out very quickly. And so I was the first person that Kelly Johnson brought into his advanced development projects, which is really the modernized version of the Skunk Works. I was the first person who was brought in to help try to reduce the ability of the Soviet Union's radars to detect, that is, early warning, and follow or track the aircraft once it was in the air, presumably over their territory.
One of the things we get from reading your book is that you guys had to be inventing stuff, and you had to have been under intense pressure to get it done quickly. Tell us about that.
Well, that's true. We did. I say we, and that includes a large number of really talented people and very dedicated people. But almost everything in the U-2 and the following aircraft had to be either invented or developed quickly from what little was known about some of the things. And I had a lot of fun. I really enjoyed what I was doing, and I think a lot of others did also, even though it was pretty serious. I worked under the security classification of top secret special access required, and a large number of other people eventually did that also. The original group that Kelly, imported from various parts of the Lockheed Burbank company had Luther McDonald, who was in charge of the effort to reduce the radar cross-section, as it's called. Melvin George, who was designated chemist for the Skunk Works, which it was called Skunk Works at that time. And he had another chemist who was an excellent chemist, Perry Merlin Reedy. Now, Merlin was really well named because he almost seemed to be able to do magic with chemical stuff. I was one of that group. In fact, that was the entire group at the beginning of the effort to reduce the cross-section of the U-2. The original group of people who served as consultants for the CIA, which was under Dr. Bissell, they had made some efforts to determine how long the U-2 would be able to successfully obtain photographs, but basically photographs, but also intercepting radio traffic in the Soviet Union. And they decided that the aircraft would probably not be useful for more than 2 years. It turned out that was actually used intermittently under strict control of President Eisenhower for about 4 years. So there was a lot of good information apparently that was available from the U-2. The U-2 was basically, it looked like a sailplane. It had a very large, very, well, I'll call it aspect ratio wing. The original wing was about 70 feet wide. And Gary Powers was a pilot who was shot down over Soviet Union in 1960.
You met Gary Powers. What was he like?
Well, I didn't know him well. I only worked with him for less than a month, I guess, after he came back from the Soviet Union. And but he was a very nice guy, and he was a very good pilot, naturally. And he blended into the Skunk Works very well. He and Mel George worked together on a program to try to determine what color an aircraft should be painted to minimize visual detection by the Soviet fighter pilots. But he didn't stay with Lockheed very long. I don't know any of the reasons why, but apparently he got a job he liked better, flying a news helicopter.
Well, there you go. Now, your technology that you helped develop went on to be used in the famous stealth bomber that still flies today in action. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I don't know that I can tell you much that hasn't been published already. In fact, I won't if I did know it. But anyway, there were three aircraft that were followers of the U-2. The U-2 was subsonic. It could only fly about 600 miles an hour ground speed, and it generally cruised at about 70,000 feet. That's about 13 miles up. And as I say, it was only a temporary expedient to pick up the knowledge that was needed for the security of our whole country and possibly even the world, because the Soviets were they were very much interested in controlling as much as they could. Now, during the time between about August of 1957, when I joined the Skunk Works, we worked for a short time trying to make the U-2 less detectable so that we had more time to do something else. And in 1958, Kelly Johnson was already working on designs for a very much more, well, I'll say a much more able aircraft. We went through a number of design studies involving what we call an anechoic chamber. That's equivalent to a chamber in which there are no reflections from the walls. And so it would be somewhat like being in free space, which is the environment naturally of aircraft. But we went through using scale models, very similar to working in a wind tunnel. We went through 11 different designs, which were designed to fly at hopefully 3 times the speed of sound and 100,000 feet altitude. Well, it turned out that we went through 11 of those and finally came up with what was called the A-12 aircraft, which the CIA, who was funding the program, called an ox cart, with an attempt to fool the Russians. I don't know if it did or not, but anyway, it was a very good aircraft. It had to fly at as close to 100,000 feet or cruise at close to 100,000 feet as possible. It turned out, of course, that there was enough equipment in there required by the CIA to get information that the maximum altitudes that I heard about were approximately 90,000 feet, which is a little over 17 miles up. That aircraft, when it flew, suffered a lot of heating from air friction. Average temperature of the aircraft itself was about skin temperature, we called it, about 450 degrees Fahrenheit, that is. And that caused a lot of problems in terms of materials that would stand all the temperatures that we would encounter. Some parts of the airplane, the leading edges of the wings, and what we call the chines, which were the sort of an extension of of the fuselage. It looked a little bit like wings, and also was an aerodynamic surface. But anyway, some of the temperatures encountered in various parts of those were up to 850 degrees or so, and at the outlet for the exhaust, some parts of those metal parts, obviously, were 1,000 degrees. So there was a significant situation that had to be controlled there. And that meant that they had to have special materials, and this is where some of the inventions might have come in. Kelly Johnson and his people decided that the airplane would have to be made of titanium. So about 93% of that airplane is made of titanium alloy that could stand the temperature without weakening. Other materials were not suitable. They were either too heavy, such as stainless steel, or they would tend to weaken as the temperature increased, such as the conventional aluminum alloys. That was only the start of the situation. They had to have special material for the tires. They had to have special materials for sealing the gasoline or the fuel tanks. They didn't use gasoline. They used very low vapor pressure materials for the fuel. They had to be careful about evaporation and pressure buildup, and they had a lot of problems with that. But
now, Mr. Lovick, you have been extremely generous with including all of the people you worked with. Very modest. But what, as you look back upon your career, do you think stands out as your personal accomplishment?
Well, there is one that I sound like bragging, but it's really true, and that Kelly Johnson gave me credit for saving the A-12, or the Oxcart program. The first triple sonic aircraft could cruise at 90 or 1,000 feet or so. That's in my book. That's the situation was we had to have occasional, approximately once a month, progress reports to the CIA director and some of his consultants. So one of these meetings, everything went along quite well until we got to the question of the exhaust openings on the aircraft. There were two openings which were each 5 feet in diameter. And the problem that was brought up about those was that they were very large collectors of radar energy. They could make the aircraft very visible to anything trying to follow it. At that time, I wasn't aware, and I still don't know for certain, that the Soviets had an aircraft that would do it, but they had some missiles that probably could. So the situation was so bothersome to Dr. Bissell that he almost canceled the program at that stage, which would have been a disaster to Lockheed as well as, I think, to the CIA. But anyway, I suggested that we could close those openings electrically by ionizing the exhaust gases, and I proposed a way to do it, and caused considerable excitement, but that's what saved the program at that stage. So to me, that's a highlight.
Why did you set about writing this book?
I'm not completely sure that I had one reason, but I did want my family to know something about what I had done for several years, that they didn't know anything about what I was doing. We were not allowed to talk to anybody other than the people we were working with, so my family knew nothing about it. Then I also wanted to do two other things, one of which was to encourage young people, especially young ladies, to consider becoming engineers or physicists or some other technical thing, because I had the impression that they had been talked out of the situation by being told they couldn't do it. And I know very well from my first wife, who died, she was not educated as an engineer, but she had all the engineer's qualities. Analyze problems and solve them and do it in a good way. Also, I had two daughters, one of which was also very much of I'd say, technically competent person. She wasn't a real engineer, but she came close to it. And then, after my first wife had died, 2 years later after that, I married another engineer, a female engineer who worked in the Skunk Works. And so I was convinced that women could do very well, and they have shown they can. The other thing is, I wanted to give some credit to some of the men I worked with who otherwise probably would never gotten any significant recognition, but who did, I think, very important things to help the radar problem. I think it's quite well detailed in the book.
Mr. Lovick, I'd like to thank you very much for your time on this. It's been fascinating, a glimpse into part of the past in the recent history of America that a lot of people don't even know about.
Well, that's true, and there's lots of other things that even I didn't know about, even at that time or now. But it was, to me, it was important work. I met a lot of people who were very talented, very committed to doing a good job, and they did. I couldn't put everything I wanted to in the book, although my engineer wife, who did important work in the Skunk Works, helped me to more or less winnow out what we both thought was not appropriate for most people who might read this. But I was hoping that those people who, well, I'll say the wives, for example, of men who worked in the Skunk Works and who now have passed on, would appreciate at least knowing something about what went on. And that was, to me, a satisfying thing to do.